Welcome to How to Yu-Gi-Oh! Let's explain the Psalms of Kings. Chapter 1. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the Psalms of Kings. What I feel it's introducing to the game, coming in Alliance Insight, which is a few months from now, and how it changes our trap perception in Yu-Gi-Oh! With that being said, let's get on with the rest of the video. Chapter 2. Psalms of Kings Implications. And so in this part, I want to mention what are the implications of a card like Psalms of Kings? What does it do for Yu-Gi-Oh! Having a trap search another trap? Obviously, like Imperm, it negates a card and then it searches another trap if there's another trap in the graveyard, specifically the Dominus series. Now, why I like the Psalms and what it implies for traps going forward is that traps, if they want to secure a place in the competitive scene, but not just secure a place in the competitive scene, but secure a place in profitability, usability, and just flexibility, they need to act as traps, but they need to bring more to the table.
You are absolutely right.
And indeed, Psalms of Kings is a great experiment to see if we can add this implementation of a trap card, adding other powerful trap cards.
When nothing ruins the game plan.
I think part of the problem with traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! At the moment is that they've lacked a purpose and they've lacked a function. And sure, many would say that we have Imperm, but therein lies the problem. Look at Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now, and the only trap we are playing is infinite impermanence. In fact, even the Dominus cards are looking to be cards that we are not purged, is looking to be a card that was played for a bit and then has vanished. Impulse again is looking to be a card that it was played for a bit and then vanished. Indeed, even Transaction Rollback is looking to be a card that was played and then vanished. There is a problem with traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole. If it's not a card like Infinite Impermanence, its usage is completely dropped and it is completely just abandoned to the wayside. Traps need to change in Yu-Gi-Oh! Traps need a defining role, a defining factor. And I'm liking the experimentation with Psalms of Kings. I'm liking what Konami's doing here with this trap, and I'm liking with where this is going. Is Psalms of Kings the best trap that's coming out of Alliance Insight? Absolutely not. Are there better things we should be doing with traps? Absolutely. But if Konami wants to get out of the hole that traps are in, especially for OCG and TCG, traps need to be redefined. Let's hammer home at that point. Chapter 3. Redefining traps. When it comes to redefining traps, we've got to realize where traps are in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now, traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are only seen for one thing, especially in the competitive scene, but for most of the player base, traps are seen as floodgates.
Not even mad, just disappointed.
They have been seen as cards that basically are unfun to play, that bring about despair.
Why does everything you do relate to death?
Desolation, and just straight up misery. This aspect of traps needs to change. And in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, traps had a purpose, especially battle traps, traps that disrupted summons like Torrential. Traps had purpose and had a use. They balanced out what the game was at the moment, and they were a great trifecta, as you had spells doing one thing, traps doing another thing, and monsters doing another thing. This trifecta, however, over the years has been broken, especially as we can see with introduction, especially coming into the XYZ era, traps were completely left at the wayside. It was at this point that the acceleration of monsters and spells and their advancements could be seen, but traps were nowhere to be seen, and traps just couldn't keep up. If traps are going to be used in the modern age, they need to be redefined, and they need to act as traps, but need to do something more and need to be more.
That sounds oddly familiar.
The first step in redefining traps, and we can see with Konami doing so, but I like the idea, is that traps need to function as traps. And I believe the effect of Psalms of Kings is a step in the right direction, where it replaces itself if you play another trap. Indeed, traps need to also be designed in a way, as we say with the second point, that reinforces more traps.
What the hell does that even mean?
And herein lies the other problem. The effects of traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are just lacking. They're lacking in power, lacking in substance, and lacking in a lot of things. Look at the most powerful traps we have in the game and look at their adoption rate, look at their usage rate. Look at a card like Transaction Rollback, as you can see in front of you. This card is absolutely cracked, and we know this effect is cracked as copying effects when it's on a monster or a spell card. We've seen straight away in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, copying effects are banned.
We all know copying can lead to a lot of broken things.
We've seen it on countless monsters that when a card can copy effects, especially on a monster, it is banned. On a spell, we see the same thing. It is banned or limited. Yet we see the same copying effect on a trap, and rollback has not been hit on both OCG and TCG at this present point in time. And you might ask yourself, why is this the case? Indeed, for future card design, transaction rollback looks a bit limiting, but you fail to see the bigger picture. Traps are in such a bad state that even a card like transaction rollback will not see a ban, I would say, unless the trap adoption rate is increased. The adoption rate for traps in Yu-Gi-Oh!, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, but just in Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole, is a shocking 1%. If the card isn't infinite impermanence, the card isn't used in decks at all. And even if you're an exception like Labyrinth, there's only very few traps that you're playing on a whole. Possibly you are playing transaction rollback and then impermanence, and then the other traps you're playing will be your archetypal traps, and that's about it. Now, sure, you're gonna play some other traps, but again, those will be in the side, or some specific traps will be depending on the format that we're in. The point is that traps have to be redefined. And we come to the third point, is that traps need to, when they activate the effects, don't just need to replace themselves, but they need to be worth it.
That's no good.
This is the issue with traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now. And I think this is where I need to ask the question, is a trap worth it in Yu-Gi-Oh? You look at a trap like Infinite Impermanence, it's worth it. Why? You can use it as a hand trap, you can use it as a normal trap. You look at Transaction Rollback, it's worth it. Why? Because it can copy other normal traps that you have in your graveyard. It can set up a lot of things. Traps are lacking power, are lacking substance, and are lacking utility. This is the problem with traps at the moment in Yu-Gi-Oh! They're defined by their power, and their power and utility is completely lacking, right? So, what does this mean about traps? Traps need to be redefined. Number one, they need to have power and utility, okay? They need to be useful for the game as a whole. Spells and monster effects have now been sped up. Traps are being left at the wayside because they have no power, they have no utility, as monsters and spells fill that role. Traps need a role once again. They also need to replace themselves in some way. Traps have a significant issue in Yu-Gi-Oh! As they don't replace themselves, or they don't add other powerful traps to supplement their already slow nature. We can see as well with Malice again. Malice is an example of how we can do traps right, as traps are being able to be activated the turn they're set. This is a new feature this is an old feature that we've seen on some traps especially, We saw it in the Dimension Slice. This is one card that you could activate the turn it was set if you controlled an XYZ monster. Indeed, that is the case. But we can see here that the ability of activating a trap the turn it is set was a very innovative thing that was introduced in XYZ era. Only one trap had it, and now we're having a whole archetype do it. And look at what it has done. When we look at Malice at the moment is now in the competitive scene. Why is that the case? Sure, most can say that the Malice archetype is quite busted, but the point is that traps are a huge indicator for this case. The ability to activate traps the turn they are set is huge and massive. And this to me is how traps are getting redefined at this point in time. There have only been two instances in Yu-Gi-Oh's history that traps have been in the competitive scene. That has been with Labyrinth, and now the second instance is now with Malice, with its introduction and playstyle. One of the reasons why Malice is really loved by players, and I know some pro players would say that they don't like Malice a lot, is because it brings the usage of traps to the forefront. We're seeing a forgotten part of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, of Yu-Gi-Oh's legacy, of Yu-Gi-Oh's playstyle being brought into the forefront and being used in innovative and creative ways. This is part of the big reason why Malice is so beloved, I think. Because traps are used in it, but traps are used to do healthy and creative things. Look at the Malice traps, and this is how we want traps to be in Yu-Gi-Oh! We want them to be versatile, we want them to be malleable, we want them to fit the situation. And that's all I've got to say. Let's head on to the conclusion. Final chapter. The overall conclusion. When I talk about Psalms of Kings and I talk about traps in Yu-Gi-Oh!, Psalms of Kings gives me hope. It gives me a light at the end of the tunnel, and seeing that Konami is taking the position of traps very seriously. And Psalms of Kings is not only a step in the right direction, but a step to redefining traps for Yu-Gi-Oh! Going forward. The ability to have the effect of imperm and to be able to search other powerful traps is the building block and the steps to get traps out of the hole that they're in. I believe Psalms of Kings is going to set a new standard for traps moving forward. If we can get traps of a similar nature, traps that can act as traps, first of all, can add other traps, and can make the power and utility of traps worth it. For the first time when Psalms of Kings was introduced, and especially when we see the community's take on this and its power level, there was some huge interest in this trap. This trap all of a sudden had some significance and had purpose, had meaning. The last time I've seen a card with such sort of meaning and such sort of reaction from the community was Infinite Impermanence, that was released a few years back. So this gives me hope. This gives me some relevance of how I'm seeing traps go forward in the future. And indeed, if traps can be brought fully into the competitive scene and we can see more traps in deck builds right now and can shoot up the abysmal adoption rate from 1% to maybe even 50%, I believe one card combos are going to see a die-off, and the unhealthy parts of Yu-Gi-Oh! Are going to die off quickly. My hot take is part of the reason why we have such toxic behavior in Yu-Gi-Oh! At the moment is because traps are not in our game as a whole. There's a lot of good traps we have in Yu-Gi-Oh! But because they do not have power, they do not have utility, traps, like hand traps, are the first line of defense for unhealthy and toxic plays. When the traps are in your deck, are part of the trifecta, it means that creating or making toxic boards or toxic plays are something that is harder to do. Say, for example, if everyone had a modern version of Torrential Tribute in their deck and were playing it, you're going to see less spamming of a lot of monsters. Indeed, the inclusion of cards similar to Torrential Tribute, the inclusion of cards similar to Dharma Cannon, or cards mass destruction, mass banishing, mass anything, means the playstyle of players and the playstyle of the competitive scene changes completely. As being the first line of defense to absolute nonsense, traps are there to hold the line and make sure that Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't become unhealthy in the competitive scene. The problem is that when traps were completely removed from the competitive scene, monsters and spells go unchecked, the more they get improved and the more the effects become stronger and stronger and stronger. Without traps being there as a limiting factor, as a stopgap to keep these two factors of Yu-Gi-Oh in check, Yu-Gi-Oh just goes to a sloppy mess. That is my hot take on the role of traps in Yu-Gi-Oh. They have a significant role in Yu-Gi-Oh to balance Yu-Gi-Oh. Their inclusion is just as important, maybe even more important than spells or traps. And so, what do I think about Psalms of Kings? What do I think about the role of traps in the future? I think we're in a good place. I think Psalms of Kings is, as I've said before, a step in the right direction to the blueprint of what we need traps to be starting in 2025 and moving forward. And traps need to be of this nature. They need to have similar or a stronger power level than Psalms of Kings. They also need to replace themselves in innovative ways. I like the way of replacing themselves with traps, but maybe we could have more and interesting ways of replacing themselves going in the future. Let's not just put in slap on, add another trap when a trap is activated. Let's have more innovative ways. But most importantly, they need to have purpose in Yu-Gi-Oh as a whole. It's all very well having the power, but if they have no purpose in Yu-Gi-Oh, then they're not going to be adopted either. So one, they need to have a power, and need to be malleable. Two, they need to replace themselves in an innovative way, and three, they need to have purpose. And that's it. So tune in next time as we'll talk about other things in Yu-Gi-Oh. Hope to see you soon.
We come to the end of this video. So, as I like to say, you are one step closer to becoming a Yu-Gi-Oh master. My fate, right, is in your hands.